The sound of the door closing behind Dove echoed like a dry snap, a silent mark of the change about to unfold. She looked around, taking in what until then had seemed like a distant dream. Adam and Tony's apartment didn't yet have the warmth of a home, but it held the promise of becoming one. The teenager felt the shift in the air, as if it had a different texture here, as if the future was starting to take shape before her, but without knowing whether it would be a comfortable or painful future. At 16, Dove had been through more foster homes than she could count. The other parents had tried, but she never felt truly settled, never found a place she could call home. With each change, each new attempt, a part of her seemed to be lost. She knew what it was like to be invisible, but had no idea what it was like to truly be seen, to be loved. Not until she met Adam and Tony, Adam with his warm smile and friendly demeanor, and Tony with his firm and calming presence, were different. They were willing to guide her, not as a project, but as someone with her own space to grow. But what Dove didn't know was that, despite their good intentions, nothing could prepare them for what she would face at the new school they were about to enroll her in. A prestigious private school in a rich, sophisticated town. The morning that followed brought a mix of expectations and fears. Dove was curled up in the back seat of Adam's car, the nervousness reflected in her distant gaze, as if she were preparing for something she could not predict. Tony, driving, flashed a calm smile, but Dove felt the pressure. It was another new beginning, and she didn't know if she had the strength to start again. It's going to be fine, you'll see. We're here, and we're going to get through this together, Adam said, trying to reassure her. We chose this school because we believe it's the best place for you to learn and grow. Dove didn't respond. Her thoughts were elsewhere. She wanted to believe Adam's words, but her mind clung to a bitter doubt. Would she, in the end, be accepted? Or just another outsider, a girl who didn't fit in? When they arrived at the school, the red brick building seemed like a fortress, large, imposing, and full of unfamiliar faces. Adam led her to the main entrance, where a group of students, all in impeccable uniforms, stopped to watch her, as if she were an exotic novelty to be studied from afar. Inside the school, the first days were a mix of silence and furtive glances. Dove felt like a stage prop, exposed, yet invisible at the same time. The students weren't directly cruel, but their behavior had an emptiness to it, something Dove knew all too well: microaggressions. She noticed the whispers behind doors, the quick glances that diverted when she looked at them. She could feel the weight of unsaid words and the discomfort in the air, as if she were an unwelcome presence. But what bothered her the most were the looks from the teacher, a middle-aged woman who treated the other students with ease, but kept her distance with Dove, an unease Dove couldn't understand. Dove tried to adapt. She began straightening her hair, thinking it would be easier, more acceptable. After all, in the school where she had grown up, her curly hair was the subject of jokes, and she had learned early to hide the features that made her different. Inside, she knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what else to do. "You look beautiful like this," Tony had said when he first saw her with straightened hair. But she knew he didn't understand what was happening. He didn't understand that the problem wasn't her wanting to fit in, but the need to hide herself so that others wouldn't see who she truly was. Days went by, and the feeling of being torn between being herself and being accepted intensified. Dove began to lose herself. The straightened hair didn't make her feel more beautiful. It only made her look like a faded version of who she really was. She no longer knew what she liked, what she wanted, and with every sideways glance from her classmates, she distanced herself even more from who she really was. One afternoon, Adam entered Dove's room and found her sitting on the bed, her hair loose, visibly unsatisfied. "Are you okay, sweetie?" he asked, sitting next to her. His tone was gentle, but there was clear concern in Adam's eyes. Dove looked at the mirror, her eyes reflecting a face that seemed more distant than ever. "I don't know, Dad. I don't know if I can fit in here." Adam sighed and leaned closer. "You don't have to fit in, Dove. You don't have to change who you are so others feel better. You're beautiful just the way you are." But Dove wasn't ready to hear that. She wanted to believe, but the world outside her room seemed too cruel. The hair, the skin tone, everything seemed to be a reason for judgment. Deep down, she knew the real challenge wasn't the school. It was the battle within herself. This was only the beginning of Dove's struggle to understand her own worth, and Adam and Tony's struggle to help her discover the strength she already possessed. The road would be long, but together they were willing to face whatever came their way. The days at the new school started to blend into one long, oppressive blur. Dove felt herself retreating further into the shadows, becoming more of an observer than a participant. Her classmates had already formed their circles tight, unyielding, and she was left on the outside, watching them live lives she felt she would never belong to. The whispers continued, subtle but sharp, always just beyond her reach. It was as if she were a ghost walking among the living, never truly seen, never truly heard. At home, Adam and Tony did their best to reassure her. They were patient, loving, always there when she needed them. But the weight of the world outside was too heavy for Dove to simply shrug off. Each day, as she stepped out of the safety of their home and into the harsh realities of the school, she felt a little more of herself slip away. She tried to hide it, tried to pretend that everything was fine, but the cracks were beginning to show. One evening, Tony sat down with her on the couch. He had always been the more nurturing of the two, always knowing the right thing to say to make Dove feel at ease. But this time he said nothing at first. He simply looked at her, his eyes full of concern. "Dove," he said gently, "I can see that you're struggling. You don't have to pretend with us. We're here for you." She turned to face him, her eyes hollow, the weight of her thoughts pressing against her chest. "I don't know how to fit in, Tony. I don't think I ever will." Tony smiled softly, his hand brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't have to fit in, Dove. You just need to be yourself. We'll help you see the beauty in who you are, inside and out." But Dove wasn't sure she could believe him anymore. She had been trying so hard to fit into a mold that wasn't hers, trying to change herself so that others would see her as valuable. It had never worked. No matter how many times she straightened her hair, no matter how many times she smiled and pretended she was fine, it never felt like enough. Adam, who had been quiet until now, joined the conversation. "Sweetheart, you're already perfect as you are. You don't need to change for anyone. Not even for us. We love you just as you are." Dove looked at them both, feeling the warmth of their words, but still, there was a distance inside her that no one could bridge. It's hard, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's hard to believe that when everyone around me is so different, when they look at me and see something else. You're not alone, Tony said, squeezing her hand. We've been there too. We know what it's like to feel like you don't belong. But the truth is, Dove, you belong everywhere. You belong in this family, and you belong in this world. It's just a matter of finding your place. Her mind raced with the weight of their words, but she still wasn't sure how to accept them. She had always felt like an outsider first in the foster homes and now at this school. She didn't know how to stop being invisible. The next day at school, the feeling of isolation was even more suffocating. Dove's classmates seemed to notice her less and less. She walked through the hallways, her eyes glued to the floor, trying to make herself small, trying to go unnoticed. But the whispers followed her. The comments about her hair, about her skin, those little slights that weren't enough to be considered outright bullying, but were enough to leave a scar. At lunch, she sat alone at a table in the corner of the cafeteria, picking at her food. The other kids sat in their cliques, laughing and chatting, oblivious to her presence. It was always the same. The table was there, but it was as though it didn't have a seat for her. Then a voice cut through the noise. "Hey, are you okay?" Dove looked up to see a girl standing in front of her. The girl was a few years older, with a big smile and curly hair like Dove's. Her name was Jamila, and Dove recognized her from class. Jamila's presence was like a breath of fresh air in a room that had been suffocating her. "I see you sitting here alone," Jamila continued. "I don't like seeing people get ignored. Want to join us?" Dev felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she hesitated. She had never been invited into a group before, not like this, not with someone who seemed genuinely interested in her. "Are you sure?" Dove asked, her voice unsure. "Of course," Jamila said with a smile. "We're all different here, and I think you'll fit in just fine." For the first time since she started at this school, Dove felt a flicker of hope. She stood up and followed Jamila to the table, where a small group of students were talking and laughing. They all greeted her warmly, and Dove felt a little less invisible. Maybe, just maybe, there was a place for her here after all. When she got home that evening, Adam and Tony could see the difference in her. There was a lightness in her steps, a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. They both smiled, silently acknowledging the shift. Dove wasn't there yet, but she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find her place in the world. And so the process of healing began. Dove started to embrace her natural hair again, stopped trying to change herself for the sake of others. She began to see the beauty in her curls, in her skin, in the things that made her different. It wasn't an easy journey, but with Adam and Tony by her side, she learned to face the challenges of the world with newfound strength. One afternoon, as Dove was sitting in the living room with Adam and Tony, she turned to them, her voice filled with determination. "I'm not going to change who I am anymore. I want to be proud of myself, of everything that I am." Adam and Tony exchanged a proud glance, knowing that Dove had taken a huge step. The path ahead was still uncertain, but they were ready to face it together. As a family, the school year continued, and Dove began to find her rhythm. The whispers had not stopped, nor had the microaggressions. There were still moments where the weight of the world seemed unbearable, where Dove wanted to run back to the safety of her room and hide beneath the covers. But now there were moments of light in between the conversations with Jamila, the small acts of kindness that kept her going. Dove's relationship with Jamila blossomed into something deeper. Jamila, with her infectious energy and unshakable confidence, became a safe harbor for Dove. They spent afternoons together, talking about everything from music to boys, to the challenges of living in a world that often overlooked them. Jamila would listen, nodding with empathy, never offering pity, only understanding. It was a rare gift, one that Dove had never truly experienced before. You don't have to prove anything to them. Dove, Jamila said one afternoon as they sat in the school courtyard, you already have everything you need. Your hair, your skin, your mind, it's all part of who you are, and that's more than enough. Dove was still learning to believe it. She had spent years trying to fit into someone else's definition of beauty, trying to make herself palatable for the world that constantly told her she wasn't enough. But slowly she was starting to see herself differently. Her curls, once a source of shame, were now a crown. Her skin, once a marker of difference, became a badge of honor. Jamila had introduced Dove to a group of girls who, like her, were navigating their own struggles with identity and self-worth. They were a patchwork of backgrounds and experiences, but they shared one thing in common, the understanding that they were enough as they were. Dove hadn't realized how much she needed that sense of belonging, but now it was beginning to feel like home. Still, the world outside their circle was not kind. Dove could feel the judgment in the looks from some of her classmates, the subtle, condescending remarks from a few teachers who seemed to view her as a charity case rather than a student. The feeling of being different never quite went away, no matter how many times she stood up a little taller, how many times she smiled a little brighter. One day the tension reached a boiling point. Dove had just stepped out of class when she heard a group of girls behind her. They were talking loudly, laughing as they walked. She didn't pay much attention at first, until she caught the tail end of a conversation. "Have you seen Dove's hair today? It's like she's trying to be all natural or something," one of the girls sneered. "She should just stick to straightening it like everyone else. It's not cute." Dove froze in her tracks. The words stung more than she had expected. They weren't loud enough for anyone else to hear, but they were loud enough to pierce her heart. She felt her stomach tighten, her breath quicken. The weight of the world settled back on her shoulders, heavier than before. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she walked away quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. That evening, when she got home, Dove went straight to her room. She didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to hear the usual reassurances. The tears came quickly, and soon they were flooding her face. She buried her face in her pillow, trying to stifle the sobs. The emotions, the hurt, the anger, the frustration were too much to hold in. It was Tony who found her, sitting on the edge of her bed, looking defeated. Without a word, he sat next to her and pulled her into a hug. Dove clung to him, the tears flowing freely now. "I don't want to go back," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't want to be the person they make me feel like I am." Tony didn't say anything for a long while. He just held her, letting her cry until the storm inside her had passed. When she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, Tony spoke softly. "Dove, the world might try to tell you who you should be, but they don't get to define you. You define yourself." and you're beautiful, inside and out, no matter what they say." Adam came into the room, his presence grounding, steady. "We've always told you the truth," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You don't need their approval. You have ours, and that's more than enough." Dove felt the warmth of their love, but the battle raged within her. The world outside her school, her peers, even some of her teachers, didn't care about her. They didn't care to see her as she was, to see her as someone worthy of respect. But maybe, just maybe, if she could start seeing herself that way, things could change. The next day, something shifted. Dove wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the way she had been held by Adam and Tony the night before, or maybe it was the quiet reassurance in their voices. But when she walked into school, she walked a little taller, her head held higher. She still felt the stares, still heard the whispers, but they didn't sting as much. She had a power now, a quiet strength that came from within. During lunch, she sat with Jamila and her friends, laughing and talking like she had never done before. And when one of the girls from the previous day made a snide comment about her hair, Dove didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She turned to the girl and smiled, a calm, steady smile. "Actually," she said, her voice steady, "I love my curls. They're beautiful. And they're mine. Maybe you should try loving yours too." The girl was stunned, but Dove didn't care. She didn't need her approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. And for the first time in a long time, Dove felt like she was finally finding her place, her real place in the world. The weeks following that moment marked a change in Dove. It wasn't an instant transformation, and it wasn't without setbacks, but she could feel that something had shifted deep within her. She began to realize that she wasn't just surviving in that world anymore. She was learning how to stand tall in it, despite all its ugliness. And her parents, Adam and Tony, were right beside her, unwavering in their support. At school, Dove found herself growing more and more confident. She started to understand that her hair wasn't a flaw to be hidden, but a crown to be worn. Each curl, each coil represented her heritage, her strength, and her identity. She no longer wasted hours trying to smooth it down to fit into a mold that wasn't meant for her. Instead, she embraced it, taking pride in her hair's wild, untamed beauty. Her classmates noticed the change too. Dove had always been the quiet girl who tried to blend into the background, but now she wasn't so easily overlooked. There was something magnetic about her newfound confidence, something that demanded respect without ever having to ask for it. It wasn't that the whispers stopped entirely, no. They still found ways to slither through the cracks, but Dove learned how to let them bounce off her without losing her stride. The comments still stung at times, especially when they came from teachers. There were days when Dove would sit in class, feeling the weight of their judgmental eyes on her, but instead of shrinking into herself, she would remember what Tony and Adam had told her. "You are enough." She didn't need validation from anyone except herself. And slowly, she started to believe it. The turning point came one fateful afternoon in the school library. Dove had been working on a project with Jamila when a teacher, Mrs. Hamilton, approached them. Mrs. Hamilton had always been distant, never quite hiding her discomfort with Dove's presence in her classroom. She had an air of superiority, as if Dove didn't belong in a place like that. Today, however, it was different. "Are you really sure that's how you want to wear your hair, Dove?" Mrs. Hamilton asked, her tone sugar-sweet, but laced with a hint of condescension. "It looks a bit unruly, don't you think?" Dove felt a familiar pang of hurt, but instead of letting it overwhelm her, she took a deep breath and stood up straighter. Jamila shot her a look, a silent message of support, and Dove knew it was time to take a stand. "I like it this way, Mrs. Hamilton," Dove said, her voice clear and unwavering. "It's who I am, and I'm not going to apologize for it." "Mrs." Hamilton's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing as if she hadn't expected Dove to speak back. For a brief moment the air felt thick with tension, but Dove didn't back down. She held her ground, and when Mrs. Hamilton turned and walked away, Dove felt something inside of her snap into place. She was no longer afraid. That evening, when Dove told Adam and Tony about what had happened, they weren't surprised. They had seen this moment coming, and they were proud of their daughter for standing up for herself. They didn't just see the girl who had walked into their lives years ago, vulnerable, withdrawn, afraid of being herself. They saw a young woman who was beginning to understand her worth. "We always knew you had it in you, Dove," Adam said, smiling as he wrapped her in a hug. "You've come so far, and we're so proud of you." Dove smiled, the warmth of their love settling over her like a soft blanket. "I couldn't have done it without you too," she admitted. "You're the ones who showed me how to love myself." The rest of the school year flew by, and Dove's growth didn't go unnoticed. She began to speak out in class discussions, no longer content to sit silently on the sidelines. She became more involved in activities, joining the school's diversity club and participating in community events. Dove was no longer a passive observer of her own life. She was taking charge, shaping her own narrative. But the real test came during a school assembly on diversity and inclusion. The principal, Mr. Cooper, had invited students from various backgrounds to share their experiences with racism and discrimination. Dove wasn't sure if she was ready for it, but Jamila encouraged her to speak up. "You've got this, Dove," Jamila said, her voice full of belief. "Your story matters." With her heart pounding in her chest, Dove took the stage. The microphone felt heavy in her hand, but when she looked out at the audience, she saw Adam and Tony in the front row, their smiles giving her the strength she needed. Dove cleared her throat, her voice a little shaky at first, but as she spoke, it grew steadier. "I've spent most of my life feeling invisible," she began. "I've been told that I'm not good enough, that I don't fit in. And I've spent so much time trying to make myself smaller, to fit into someone else's idea of what I should be. But I've learned that I don't need to shrink. I don't need to hide who I am to make other people comfortable." There was a silence in the room, the kind that felt heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with anticipation, like the audience was waiting for Dove's words to sink in. "I am black, and I am proud of it," she continued. "I am proud of my hair, my skin, my culture, and I will no longer apologize for any part of who I am." The room was silent for a moment longer before a wave of applause erupted. Dove stood there, stunned, as the realization hit her. She had just spoken her truth in front of the entire school, and they had heard her. Afterward, several students came up to her, some apologizing for their past behavior, others simply offering words of support. Dove had expected the worst, but instead, she had been met with understanding and empathy. She had been brave enough to speak, and in doing so, she had changed something within herself, and perhaps within them as well. As the weeks passed, Dove's sense of self continued to grow. She no longer saw herself as an outsider, but as an integral part of her school and community. The bond with her parents, Adam and Tony, became even stronger. They had always been her anchor, but now Dove was learning how to anchor herself. She was beginning to understand what it meant to take up space in the world, to not apologize for her existence, and to wear her identity with pride. One afternoon, while Dove was in the school cafeteria, she sat down with Jamila, who had become her closest friend. Jamila was a confident, outspoken girl with a shared passion for social justice. Her own experiences with racism had shaped her into a fierce advocate, and it was no surprise that she had become one of Dove's strongest allies. "Dove, you've really changed," Jamila said, grinning as they unpacked their lunches. "I remember when you first came here, you wouldn't even make eye contact with people. Now look at you. You're the one leading the conversations, challenging people's assumptions. It's inspiring." Dove smiled, a bit shy at first. "I don't know about leading, but yeah, I guess I'm starting to feel more like myself. It's still hard sometimes, but I'm learning." "I've been thinking about something," Jamila said, her tone turning more serious. "I want to do something big for Black History Month, something that really makes an impact." "I think you should be a part of it." Dove raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've got the power to inspire people, Dove," Jamila continued. "We should do a project about the history of Black women and their impact on society. We could put together a presentation, showcase the struggles we've faced, and highlight the beauty in our culture and heritage. What do you think?" Dove felt a spark of excitement. It was exactly what she needed, an opportunity to channel everything she had been learning about herself and her identity into something that would be meaningful for others. She had spent so much of her life trying to fit into a mold that wasn't hers, but now she could create her own. "I'm in," Dove said, her voice steady. "Let's do it." Jamila's eyes lit up. "I knew you'd say yes," and so the two of them got to work. They spent the next few weeks gathering research, collecting stories of powerful Black women throughout history, and putting together a multimedia presentation that was both educational and inspiring. They called it "The Strength of Her Roots," a celebration of Black women's resilience, strength, and unwavering contribution to the world. When the day of the presentation arrived, Dove felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She had come so far, but standing in front of her peers still made her stomach churn with anxiety. Still, she knew this was her moment, the one she had been preparing for without even realizing it. The room was packed. Dove could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her, but instead of shrinking under the pressure, she stood tall. Jamila stood by her side, supporting her every step of the way. Together they presented the history of Black women, from civil rights leaders like Rosa Parks and Maya Angelou to artists like Nina Simone and Audre Lorde. They spoke about the struggles that had been faced, but also about the victories, the triumphs, and the undeniable beauty of Black culture. When Dove took the microphone to speak about the importance of self-love, of embracing one's natural beauty, she felt something shift inside her. The words came easily, as though they had been waiting to escape for years. "I know what it's like to feel like you don't belong, to feel like you have to change who you are to fit in. I spent so long trying to make myself smaller, to hide parts of myself that were never meant to be hidden. Dove said, her voice unwavering. "But I've learned that I don't need to change. My hair, my skin, my culture, they're not problems to be solved. They're the parts of me that make me whole. And I've learned to love them. To love myself because I deserve to." The room was silent for a moment, and then there was an eruption of applause. Dove stood there, feeling a surge of emotion. She had done it. She had stood in front of everyone and shared her truth. She had become the person she always needed someone to be for her, the person who said, "You are enough just as you are." As Dove continued to grow into her own, she began to influence the people around her in ways she hadn't imagined. Her teachers started to notice the change, too. Mrs. Hamilton, the teacher who had once questioned her hair, began to look at Dove with new eyes. It wasn't that Mrs. Hamilton suddenly became an ally, but she started to treat Dove with more respect, perhaps out of the quiet understanding that Dove had more strength and integrity than she had ever given her credit for. Other students began to ask questions about Dove's project, and some even came to her for advice on how to embrace their own identity. Dove realized that in many ways her work had just begun. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for others who might feel invisible, like she once had. At home, Adam and Tony couldn't have been prouder. They watched their daughter transform before their eyes, from the timid girl they had taken in to the confident young woman who was now making waves in her community. They knew there was still a long road ahead, but they were ready to walk it with her. One evening, as Dove sat in the living room, carefully braiding her hair while Adam and Tony watched a movie, she realized something profound. It wasn't just about standing up to racism or microaggressions. It was about owning who she was, about accepting all the parts of herself that made her unique. She had found a family that loved her for who she was, not in spite of it, and she had begun to find a way to love herself too. And that, Dove realized, was where her true strength came from. The weeks that followed Dove's presentation were marked by a shift in her life. But it wasn't a simple one. Her newfound confidence brought with it both positive and difficult changes. Dove found herself more comfortable in her skin, but the shadows of prejudice still loomed, lingering in unexpected corners of her daily life. One day, as she was walking through the hallway of her school, a group of girls who had previously ignored her started making snide remarks again. At first, Dove felt the sting, those old wounds opening once more, but she quickly realized something had changed inside her. She wasn't the same girl who had cowered in the corners of hallways, who avoided eye contact. "Look at Dove's hair today. She thinks it's cute, but it looks like a bird's nest," one of the girls sneered. Dove paused, took a deep breath, and then turned around to face them. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she refused to let the words sting her the way they once had. She had come too far for that. "It's not a bird's nest," Dove said, her voice calm but firm. "It's my hair. It's beautiful. And you're welcome to think otherwise, but I'm done letting your opinions define me. I don't need to look like you to be worthy." The girls froze. They weren't expecting that. For a moment, there was silence, and Dove stood tall, meeting their eyes without fear. Then, as if realizing they couldn't break her any more, they turned and walked away, muttering under their breath. Dove stood there for a moment, letting the rush of adrenaline fade. It was the first time she had stood her ground like that, and it felt empowering. It wasn't about the girls who had made fun of her. It was about what she had proven to herself. She had found her voice, and no one was going to take it away from her. The next day, Jamila approached her with a wide grin. "I heard what happened. That was amazing, Dove. You're really showing them what it means to be unapologetically you." Dove smiled, a quiet pride bubbling inside her. "Thanks, Jamila. It feels good to stand up for myself, you know. I don't think I've ever done that before." "You've got so much more power than you realize," Jamila said. "I'm proud of you." In the days that followed, Dove continued to face challenges, but she handled them with more grace and strength. She didn't shy away from uncomfortable conversations and was never afraid to speak up when she saw something wrong. The other students began to notice the shift in Dove. She was no longer a quiet, uncertain girl. She was a force to be reckoned with. Her voice was no longer just her own. It was a voice for others who felt like they couldn't speak. One afternoon, as Dove was leaving school with Tony, she caught a glimpse of herself in a storefront window. For the first time in a long while, she looked at her reflection, not with criticism, but with acceptance. Her hair was wild and curly, full of life, just like her. She was no longer ashamed of it. She was proud of it, proud of who she was. "Tony, look at me," Dove said, tugging at his arm. "I think I'm finally starting to get it. I love myself. I love my hair. I love everything about who I am, and I'm not going to let anyone tell me otherwise." Tony looked down at her with a soft smile, his eyes filled with pride. "I've always known you had it in you, Dove. You're stronger than you realize. You've always been enough." That night, as they sat down for dinner together, Adam joined the conversation. "It's been incredible watching you grow, Dove," he said. "But just remember, there's still so much ahead. You've only just begun to fight for yourself, for your place in this world, and we'll be here with you every step of the way." Dove nodded, feeling the warmth of their love surround her. She had found her family in Adam and Tony, and they had given her the foundation she needed to stand tall. But now she knew it was up to her to keep standing. It was a few weeks later when Dove's strength was truly put to the test. She had been invited to speak at an event for Black History Month, a panel discussion with students from various schools. It was a huge opportunity for her, an opportunity to continue her advocacy for Black identity and to represent her community. She had agreed without hesitation, eager to share her story and make a difference. The event was to be held at a large auditorium, and Dove was nervous, though she tried to mask it. Adam and Tony had encouraged her every step of the way, reminding her that her voice mattered. They helped her practice her speech, offering tips on how to command the room. But as the day approached, Dove began to feel the pressure weighing on her. When the day finally arrived, Dove found herself standing backstage, peeking out at the crowd that filled the seats. It was bigger than she had imagined. There were students, teachers, and even a few community leaders. She could hear murmurs of conversation, some laughing, some serious. The noise made her pulse quicken. Just before she was called to the stage, Dove's phone buzzed. It was a text from Jamila. "You've got this. You're going to make them listen." The words settled her nerves a little. But as she stepped out on stage, her mind went blank. She had prepared for this. She knew what she wanted to say. But now, standing in front of so many people, it felt different. It felt like a challenge, a mountain to climb. "Good evening," Dove began, her voice shaking at first, but then firming up as she found her rhythm. My name is Dove, and I'm here to talk about what it means to be a black teenager in a world that doesn't always understand you." She spoke about her experiences at school, about the struggles she had faced growing up, about the ways in which people tried to make her feel small. And then she shared her journey, how she had learned to embrace herself, her hair, her culture, and her identity. As she spoke, Dove felt the tension inside her release. The words started flowing, and she realized this was more than just a speech. This was her truth, and she wasn't afraid to share it. The audience was silent as Dove finished her story, and for a moment she thought they hadn't heard her. Then, slowly, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't just polite applause. It was genuine, it was loud, and it was filled with respect. When Dove stepped off stage, Jamila was waiting for her, her eyes wide with admiration. "You did it. You really did it. You're incredible." Dove smiled, a quiet sense of satisfaction filling her heart. "I didn't just do it for me, I did it for all of us." The weeks after the Black History Month event were a whirlwind for Dove. She was being recognized, invited to speak at more events, and making waves not just in her school, but in the wider community. But amidst all the excitement, there was an unexpected turn. One afternoon after school, Dove received a letter. It was addressed to her in a handwriting she didn't recognize. She hesitated for a moment before ripping it open. What she found inside made her heart race. The letter was from her birth mother, the woman she had never met, the one who had given her up years ago, was reaching out. She wanted to meet. Dove stood there, staring at the letter. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. There were so many questions, so many emotions flooding her at once. She had always wondered about her biological family, but now that the opportunity to meet them was here, she wasn't sure if she was ready. She had come so far. She had built a life with Adam and Tony. They had given her everything she needed to become who she was now. And yet a part of her couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity, of wanting to understand where she came from. The days following the arrival of the letter felt like a blur. Dove carried it with her everywhere, unsure of what to do next. Adam and Tony were supportive, as they always had been, but they could see the tension building in Dove. They wanted to be there for her, but they didn't want to push her into a decision she wasn't ready to make. "Are you going to meet her?" Tony asked one evening after dinner. Dove had been quiet all through the meal, her mind elsewhere. "I don't know," she replied, her voice low. "It feels strange. Part of me wants to know, but another part is scared. What if she doesn't really want to be part of my life? What if it's too late?" Adam, who had been listening quietly, chimed in. "You don't have to decide everything all at once. If you choose to meet her, we'll be with you, every step of the way. But remember, no matter what, you are part of our family, Dove. We love you." Dove nodded, appreciating their words, but the doubt still lingered. The idea of meeting her biological mother was overwhelming. What would it mean for her relationship with Adam and Tony? Would it change everything? The next morning she called the number on the letter. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number, and when the phone picked up, her heart was in her throat. "Hello?" a soft voice answered. "Hi, is this my mother?" Dove asked, her voice wavering. There was a long pause before the woman spoke again. "Yes, it is. Dove, is that you? I've thought about you every day." Dove didn't know what to say. She felt a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, but also a deep curiosity. Why now? Why after all these years? I know it's been a long time, the woman said, her voice filled with emotion. I was young when I had you. I wasn't in a place to care for you, and I made mistakes. But I've changed. I've thought about you every single day, and I've always regretted not being there for you. Dove's throat tightened. What do you want from me? I just want a chance to explain, to be a part of your life, if you'll let me, her mother replied, the desperation clear in her voice. Dove took a deep breath. She had spent so many years wondering about this moment, and now that it was here, it felt both surreal and real at the same time. She glanced over at Adam and Tony, who were sitting together on the couch, watching her. They didn't interrupt, but their presence was a silent comfort. I'll meet you, Dove said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. But I'm not promising anything. I don't know what I'll feel, and I don't know what I'll want. I understand. Thank you, Dove. I need to see you. I want to make things right. After the call, Dove didn't feel relief. Instead, she felt even more conflicted. Adam and Tony both gave her the space she needed, but the day of the meeting arrived too quickly. She had no idea what to expect. They drove to the coffee shop where they were supposed to meet. Dove's heart pounded the entire way. Adam reached over and squeezed her hand. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, he said, his voice gentle. I have to, Dove replied. I need to know for myself. They arrived, and as they walked inside, Dove's eyes scanned the room. She felt her pulse quicken when she saw a woman standing by the counter. Her eyes met Dove's, and for a brief moment time seemed to stand still. The woman looked older than Dove had imagined, but there was something familiar about her, something that made Dove's heart ache. Dove? The woman asked softly, stepping toward her. I'm so glad you're here. Dove didn't know what to say. She had so many questions, so many emotions bubbling up inside of her. She stood there, frozen, unsure of how to proceed. Hi, Dove finally said, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know where to begin, her mother said, tears welling in her eyes. I know I hurt you by not being there, by not being the mother you needed. I never stopped thinking about you. I wasn't ready to be a mother. But I've changed. Dove, I'm ready now. I want to be a part of your life if you'll let me. Dove swallowed hard, her chest tight. She felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, longing, and an undeniable pull. She wanted to ask so many things. Why did she leave? Was it because she didn't want her? But instead of asking those questions, Dove surprised herself. I don't know what to think right now, Dove said honestly. I don't know if I can just forget everything and let you back in, but I'll listen. I'll give you a chance to explain. The conversation that followed was difficult. Her mother shared everything, how she had struggled, how she had tried to change, and how much she regretted her decisions. Dove listened, but it wasn't easy. The pain of abandonment was still fresh, even after all these years. As the meeting came to a close, Dove didn't feel the closure she had hoped for. She still had more questions, more emotions to sort through. But one thing was clear. She wasn't the same girl who had been left behind. She had found a family in Adam and Tony, and their love was unconditional. It wasn't about replacing one family with another. It was about understanding who she was and where she came from. Dove spent the next few weeks reflecting on everything that had happened. She had given her birth mother the chance to explain herself, but nothing had changed the way she felt. There were still too many unanswered questions, too much hurt. She wasn't sure if she could ever fully embrace this new relationship. But there was one thing she knew for certain: she was not alone. She had Adam and Tony. They had given her the love, security, and strength she had always longed for. They had shown her what family really meant. "I don't know what the future holds," Dove said one evening as she sat between Adam and Tony on the couch. "But I know one thing: I'm happy here with you. I'm proud of who I am now, and I'm not going to let anyone take that away from me." Adam smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "We're proud of you, Dove. You've come so far, and we'll always be here for you." Tony reached over and wrapped his arm around her. "You're not just our daughter by choice. You're our daughter by heart." Dove smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She had found her place in the world, not through blood, but through love. And that was more than enough. In the months that followed, Dove continued to grow. She became even more active in speaking out against racism, using her voice to advocate for herself and for others who felt marginalized. She was no longer just the girl who had been abandoned. She was a young woman who had found her strength, her purpose, and her family. Though her relationship with her birth mother remained uncertain, Dove knew one thing: she was exactly where she was meant to be. And with Adam and Tony by her side, she felt ready to face whatever the future held. As they sat together one evening, Dove glanced at the people who had become her family. "Thanks for believing in me," she said softly. "You've given me everything I need to be myself." Adam squeezed her hand. "We didn't give you anything, Dove. You already had everything inside you." Dove smiled, the weight of the past lifting just a little more each day. And as they sat there together, she knew she had found something far more valuable than acceptance. She had found belonging in its truest, most unconditional form.